evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Norm's been a good friend for a long time. In addition to being resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, he's also contributing editor for the National Journal and columnist for The Atlantic, part of the National Journal. You know, this is my life. I do 3 hours of radio and television every day. I follow the Congress. I talk about the Congress. I just want to tell you, I've read a lot of books about it. This is the absolute best book about the United States Congress, the whole system, how it operates, or in the case of this Congress, does not operate, which is the title. It's even worse than it looks, sort of says it all. So Norm, thanks for coming tonight. And I've read it twice, and I really encourage you to get into it. No matter how much you know about this Congress and follow it, you'll learn a lot from the book. So Norm, we know it's broken. What I'd really like to talk to you a little bit about before we get questions from our friends here is, has it always been this way? When did it change, and how can we fix it? So has it always been as bad as it is today?
No, it hasn't always been as bad, and the title's a deliberate one. I chose it. It's even worse than it looks because it never looks good. It wasn't designed to look good. It isn't supposed to look good. But this is different. And my co-author, Tom Mann, who had hoped to be here tonight but was a little bit under the weather and couldn't, and I have both been here in Washington for 43 and a half years, really immersed in the politics of the town and the country, and we've never seen it this dysfunctional. And there have been plenty of periods of dysfunction. You know, I came here in the fall of 1969. The city and the country were deeply divided over Vietnam. Although, interestingly, it didn't break down so much on party lines. The strongest supporters, really, of Richard Nixon and American involvement in Vietnam were the Southern conservative Democrats. And among the most passionate opponents were liberal and moderate Republicans like Mark Hatfield, Charlie Goodell, and Jack Javits. A little trivia for you: Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, is the son of former Senator Charles Goodell. But then we segued from that into impeachment, and you had to be here, as many of you were, to know how there were times during that process with Richard Nixon when we didn't know if the Republic would survive. And we came out of it pretty well, and it actually made it much easier to do another impeachment a couple of decades later. But for all of that, this is different. And what makes it different is not simply that it's polarized. We all know we have the partisan and ideological polarization. But frankly, there is nothing that keeps problems from being dealt with if you have sharply polarized points of view. Plenty of issues are not left-right issues. What's liberal or conservative about energy conservation, for example? And even in things like debt reduction, you can see from the Simpson-Bowles Commission and the Rivlin-Domenici Commission and the Senate's Gang of Six that you can pull people from across the spectrum and they can come up with the same template. You can cut across lines, you can make compromises, you can find common ground, but it's tribal now, Bill, and that's the difference. If you're for it, I'm against it, even if I was for it yesterday. And we see that repeated over and over again, most recently, as Pat Toomey himself said, on the gun issue in the Senate.
When did it become this way? When did it change? I know you talk about that in the book.
Yeah. I think, you know, if you really want to look at the roots of the modern tribalism, Newt Gingrich has a lot to do with it. And, you know, you could, as we say in the book, Tom and I met Newt right after he came to Congress. He was elected in 1978. And we both had, at the time, an association part-time with AEI. We created something called the Congress Project to track Congress as an institution. And one of the first things we did was to bring in a group of members, new members from the class of 1978, to have informal off-the-record dinners every 6 or 8 weeks through their first 2 years. And it happened to be an extraordinary class. We had, and we chose well, we had Newt Gingrich and Geraldine Ferraro and Dick Cheney among the freshmen. But, you know, Newt stood out. Right from the get-go, he had a fully formed theory and the tactics to break the stranglehold of what was then 24 consecutive years of Democratic majorities in the House. And, you know, at one level, I sympathized with them because they were in a trap. Every election that came up, the incumbents had huge advantages. The majority could separate it out into individual contests. Didn't matter what was happening in national politics, they could keep the majority. And so his strategy was, you got to nationalize this process and get people so disgusted with Congress that they'll say anything would be better than this. And 16 years later, after radicalizing the process, and frankly with a whole lot of help from Democrats who had become arrogant and condescending and a bit corrupt through all those years in the majority and overreacted to a lot of his prods, he made it work. I do think one part of this process that's important to realize is Newt's concept was, I have to destroy this village in order to save it. Because once we take over, then we can burnish it and make it into this huge institution again. But the people that he recruited and trained to come here basically believed we have to destroy this village in order to destroy it. And a lot of them are still around. And of course, they have begotten others who are even more extreme.
It's often stated that the problem I guess demonstrates itself in that there's no time out between campaigns. It seems like permanent campaign. Do you agree with that?
No, I do think the permanent campaign is at the core of much of this. And that was already...
Time out to govern, in other words.
It was already underway before a lot of this stuff happened. But it really is the case. When I came here, and for a couple of decades thereafter, there were distinct seasons. A season of campaigning, a bit of a transition, a season of governing. And there's a dramatic difference. Campaigning is a zero-sum game. You need to destroy your opponent. There's no middle ground. And governing is an additive process. The way the framers devised it, especially, you're looking to build broad leadership consensus. So when I first got here, the campaign consultants, the pollsters, would work in the campaign, and then they'd disappear. They'd melt away. They'd do other stuff for 18 months or 20 months. And then gradually, I would go to these party retreats. I actually would go for both parties for a long time. And the Wednesday group and the Republicans in the House, Gephardt had a group in the House as well. And they go away for a few days to talk about presumably bigger issues. At first, it was 20 members, a handful of staff, and one or two outsiders like me. And then gradually it was 20 members, the staff sat way at the back, and they were replaced at the table by the pollsters and the consultants. And they were there year-round. And that changed things. But what also changed things dramatically is when Newt succeeded, 1994 brought about a very substantial change in American politics. Because in that 40 years leading up to it, where Democrats had majorities in the House, you could scarcely find an election where there was any question about who would be in the majority. Democrats could lose a bunch of seats, but the majority wasn't going to change. So you put together a whole bunch of factors, the parties becoming more cohesive and homogeneous and moving apart, the permanent campaign taking over as pollsters and consultants became integral factors, and then all of a sudden, highly competitive, closely divided elections where small things at the margins could make the difference between majority and minority, but it wasn't a difference between here and here anymore. It was a huge difference. And all of that has mattered. And now, let's face it, if you are like Bob Bennett, and you can be one of the 5 most conservative members of the Senate from Utah, but you deign to work with Ron Wyden to come up with a health care plan, even though you denounce your own plan and vote against it. So you didn't commit the sin of sleeping with the enemy. You got to first base or second base. But that's enough, you're dead. And the mindset is, if we work with them, they may gain advantage. We may lose advantage. They may get traction on an issue. We may lose a wedge issue. And it drives problem solving off into the back rooms.
So what's the end result? I mean, in 1948, Harry Truman famously won re-election by running against the do-nothing Congress. that Congress was probably prolific and very productive compared to what we have today, right?
Well, there's a great irony that the 80th Congress will forever be known as the do-nothing Republican Congress that Harry Truman ran against. But among other things, it gave us the Marshall Plan. Now, you can be very unproductive and pass one bill. Make it the Marshall Plan, you are historic. What did happen with the 80th Congress is it was the first Republican majority in 16 years. They lost the majority in 1930. They gained it back in 1946. And they gained it back in significant part because of fatigue. It happened all over the world. We saw Winston Churchill, the great hero of Western civilization, took his country from doom and won the war, got thrown out of office in 1946. People were tired of war, tired of the aftermath, time for a change. But the people who won the majority thought that they'd won not because people were ready for a change, but because they'd embraced their values, and they overreached, they pushed a lot of stuff, they got into deep confrontations with the president that the public didn't like, and they got punished in 1948, and they had picked up like 55 seats, they lost 75 seats.
Whoa.
But, and you know, then we had a little bit of closeness for a while, then 1954 broke the floodgates. So what we have now is, you know, what we say in the book is, in effect, we've got parliamentary-style parties, but in a non-parliamentary system, and a non-parliamentary culture. So you can still govern if you have majorities, although, of course, the big caveat now is another part of the tribal change. You don't succeed with a majority in the Senate. You better have 60, and you actually better have a little bit of a cushion even beyond that for everything. But, you know, we had the most productive 111th Congress since the Great Society's 89th Congress. But half the country viewed the actions as illegitimate, and we continue to get guerrilla actions taken to delegitimize and undermine laws that have been enacted. Most recently, I mean, I think stunningly, the law, the Affordable Care Act says that we will create an independent payment advisory board to look at costs in Medicare, and that it will be consist of members who will be nominated by the leaders of the parties, and the Republican leaders in the House and Senate are refusing to nominate anybody because they don't want the law to be implemented. I mean, I think that's, you know, if that's not tribal, I don't know what is. But then, of course, you segue to the real nightmare of parliamentary parties in a non-parliamentary system, which is divided government and an intense minority that can bring us what we had on the 112th Congress, which was a genuine do-nothing Congress. Smallest number of bills enacted in far more than 60 years. And the parallel to the Marshall Plan, the debt limit debacle that resulted in the first downgrade of credit in American history. A third of the bills that passed are commemoratives.
And so far it looks like the 113th may surpass the 112th in doing nothing.
You know, in a way, bizarrely, because if you think about the permanent campaign, and what embodies it is Mitch McConnell saying, my number one goal is to make Barack Obama one-term president. There's the permanent campaign in a nutshell. So after the election, I'm thinking, you know, I've been a long-time opponent of term limits, including the 22nd Amendment. You create a lame duck president. And then I started to think, you know, maybe in the era of the permanent campaign, I've been wrong about this, because Mitch McConnell can now say, okay, my number one goal is to make Barack Obama a two-term president. Mission accomplished. So with that out of the way, maybe we should govern. And you know, we've seen a few glimmers of this. And obviously we see it on immigration, but we see it on immigration not because there's this sudden, why don't we all just get along and solve this problem? There's a driving political interest that Republicans feel now, and you could see it on election eve. You go into 8 o'clock on election eve, and your presidential candidate and all of his political advisors and every one of the pollsters in the party is thinking they're going to win and win handily, and they lose in a landslide, and they're jolted. The electorate is not 50 shades of white anymore, and so you got to do something about it. But then you look at the gun issue, and you look at and the way it played out in the Senate, with Toomey saying, several of my party colleagues weren't going to vote for something that would give him a victory. Then you look at what's happening now, raising the bar to 60 and threatening filibusters with almost every cabinet nominee, or if not, dragging them through the mud to delegitimize them. And it's not clear to me that much has changed.
You've alluded twice now to the filibuster. If you can talk about that a little bit. And did Harry Reid blow it by not reforming the filibuster in January when he had a chance?
I have sympathy with Reid on this one for this reason. I mean, I'd worked a lot with several of the younger senators, and with Carl Levin, for that matter, to try and find a better alternative. But here's what Reid faced. One, it wasn't at all clear that he could get 51 votes to break the crockery in the Senate, break traditions, and do it by majority right at the beginning. Two, if he had, and it would have caused immense headaches for him, because the Republicans would then have united and used every trick at their disposal, and there are far more than Rule 22 to bring the Senate to a halt or to make it look and act in a dysfunctional fashion. And you could say, well, it would be worth it if you can get these things accomplished. Anything you could pass through the Senate is going to die in the House. So it would have been a Pyrrhic victory. Having said that, I do believe that what he worked out with McConnell, which if you look at it more deeply is very interesting, because they found expedited ways of moving legislation that the two leaders want to move, and bypass individual rank and file obstructionists. So as much as anything, that was Mitch McConnell saying, give me a little help with Ted Cruz and Rand Paul just in case I need it. But there was also, I think, a tacit, and it may have been more than tacit, understanding between the leaders that we're not going to do this on everything anymore, and particularly on nominations. And, you know, the excuse, and I saw Olympia Snowe, whom I adore and have worked with closely and think very highly of, but she said again the other day, well, we did the filibusters because Reid filled the amendment tree and we weren't allowed to offer any amendments. And there's truth about that on some of those issues. There are no amendments on nominations. You can't tell me that you're filibustering nominations because you've been denied a voice. So this is a phony argument here. And I think if we're going to see a few test cases of this on judicial nominations, where you could apportion the blame, and frankly, on this end, on many of the other nominations, it is inexplicable to me that the Obama administration wasn't ready to go with nominations or has moved as slowly as they have. But when you reject a highly qualified, widely admired nominee for the D.C. Court of Appeals, and with a flimsy excuse, she acted as a lawyer and did a brief for her client, and we didn't like the policy. And now you've got 3 other nominations coming forward, 4 of them. And I think what the Democrats will do is put up all 4 at the same, or 3 of the next ones at the same time. If those get filibustered, then it becomes very clear that this is simply a party strategy for another 4 years, which is, if you see this, there's a new report by the Congressional Research Service, done actually by a terrific political scientist who once worked with me at AEI, Barry McMillian, that shows that the blockage of court nominees is unprecedented compared to previous administrations. If that happens, and the fact that you rarely see a cabinet nominee filibustered, it takes something really extraordinary. And now we've got 3 or 4 being held. You have Sally Jewell, the Interior Secretary, being held presumably for extraneous purposes, and a lot of this is hostage taking. We have Tom Perez at Labor. We've got the EPA nominee being held, and all using tactics that are rarely used, if ever, in the past. I actually think that Reid is going to have to reconsider and maybe change the rule for nominations in the middle of the stream. You can't let this go on. I mean, you're basically crippling governance.
You know, strangely enough, though, it seems that despite the filibuster, despite the hold, we've always considered the Senate the slower body, the more deliberate body. But they've been getting more done lately than the House has been getting done. It's sort of shifted, hasn't it, where the House has become the graveyard of legislation that's passed the Senate.
There is a pretty stark contrast between the two bodies now, although it's not as stark as I thought it would be if we look at what's happened in the last few weeks. But just take a look at the fiscal cliff, right? Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the year. All these terrible things are going to happen. The sequester takes effect with sharp increases in government spending. All the tax cuts expire, and it's not just the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003. It's all the extenders, like the R&D credit. We have the end of the payroll tax cut as well. And so first you have John Boehner, who wants to get a little traction, because he knows that if nothing occurs, then all those taxes go up. It's a blow to the economy, but then January 2nd, Barack Obama can come back and say, I'm proposing one of the biggest tax cuts in American history for everybody except those making over $250,000 a year. And all of a sudden, they're not blocking tax increases, they're blocking tax cuts. So Boehner comes up with his alternative. I'd like to know what PR person decided to call it Plan B. I'm thinking, should it be over the counter? But it's basically, here's our proposal. We'll remove taxes on everybody except those making over $1 million. And the whole idea here was, we're over a barrel. If I start at $1 million and he's at 250,000, maybe we can get it to 500 or 600,000. And he gets publicly humiliated and rejected by his colleagues, not just because all of them are sort of, I won't stand for any of this. Some of them who were considering giving him that traction were basically told by the Club for Growth and the Heritage Action and others, you do this, you got a target on your backs, and you've got millions of dollars against you in primaries. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of them, it's, you know, you can't violate the Norquist Pledge anyhow. So he's left out of the picture and basically throws up his hands and says, you know, I'm not doing this anymore. And then Mitch McConnell steps in at the 11th hour with Joe Biden, and they put together this package that raises the bar to 400,000 and extends or delays the sequester for a few months. And it passes the Senate with 89 votes. Pat Toomey, who's the former president of the Club for Growth, votes for it. Jim Inhofe and Tom Coburn vote for it. 89 votes, and it gets to the House, and Boehner can barely get a third of his own members. That tells you something about the nature of the House. And I think the other reality is, in the Senate, you have a number of people, partly it's ego, partly it's just what motivated them in the first place. I had one of them tell me a couple of years ago, who was up for re-election in this last time, he said, you know, in 2 years, my 6-year contract with the people in my state is up. I'm really not anxious to go back and look at it and say, what did I do? I voted no on everything. I was just a foot soldier in the Army here. They come here to solve problems. So you've got a bunch of problem solvers, and that's why Obama has focused on them, done these dinners, and not only talked openly about cutting a deal, and here's another striking element of this, Bill. He goes to this first dinner at the Jefferson Hotel with 12 senators and tells them that he'll do chain CPI and he'll do some means testing in Medicare. And a bunch of them come out and say, well, we never knew that before. He'd never said that before. And I'm thinking, should I give you a long list of the places where he has publicly said it and committed himself to it? But you know, what's happening is, these are people who don't read or watch the stuff that a lot of others read. They get their news from Fox News and the talk radio shows and the Wall Street Journal, and it's not like the Wall Street Journal editorial page is running a banner editorial, look at what Obama's done. They ignore all of that stuff. So he let them know that, but you had a number of them, like Bob Corker, coming out and saying, you know, if he's serious about entitlements, we'll be serious about revenue. Actually said it, we'll be serious about revenue. But then, of course, you get to the next level. They say to him, look, it's fine that you said it in public, and it's fine that you've said it to us. We need something more. You got to take the lead on this. This is going to be tough for us to do. So he puts the change CPI in the budget, mentions it in the State of the Union, and then, of course, the next thing that happens is they cut his legs off by saying he wants to destroy Social Security and punish the elderly. So it becomes a problem, and if you put that together with, you know, with Lisa McCarthy and the EPA, you had all of the Republicans on the Environment Committee walk out to prevent the quorum that could get her nomination moving forward. Now, they say it's because they need more information. David Vitter has asked her to answer 693 questions, and the total number of questions they want answered is over 1,000. So, you know, this is nonsense. But you look at the list of members, and it's people who are in the problem-solving category. They're back to a tribal, we're going to unite together, and we're going to make his life miserable. And that's just, you know, Democrats are not angels, let's face it. They have been more than willing, they were more than willing when Bush was president and said, I'm dying here, help me on Social Security, to jump all over him with jackboots. And, you know, parties are going to gain advantage. But if you start with the premise that it doesn't matter what's good for the country, it doesn't matter whether governance takes a terrible blow here when we got all kinds of larger problems, but we're going to make you punish for being there, that's different than what we've seen before.
Get your questions ready. We've got about 5 more minutes here. So, tribalism, it's broken, filibuster, nothing's getting done. Both parties equally responsible?
No, as I think it's been pretty clear, as I've indicated. But I would say, you know, don't start with the premise that you've got one party that only wants to do great things and the other party only wants to do bad things. These are politicians. They're purpose-driven, and a good part of it is gaining advantage, including gaining political advantage. And the parties have both polarized. But the fact is the Democrats have moved a bit to the left. You know, if you use the football field analogy, I would say, you know, I used to say when I taught a course about Congress, I would describe the Congress. I would say to my students, imagine if we took all the members of Congress and drove them 1.5 miles due east of the Capitol to what was our football stadium, RFK, and said, go down on the field and place yourselves where your worldview, your general orientation would make you feel most comfortable. And we went up to the press box and looked down. We would see a visual representation of the bell curve, the normal distribution, vast majority of members somewhere around the midfield area, the overwhelming majority between the 35-yard lines, and a lot of admixture between the two parties. So look at it now, and basically the midfield area is pretty barren. You've still got some Democrats who are down around the 40, 45-yard line. The numbers have dwindled. The blue dogs have been cut in half and then cut in half again, but you've still got some. I would say the majority of Democrats are probably down around the 20, 25-yard line, and then you tail off to a smaller number further down. The Republicans, you're not going to find anybody at the 35 or 40-yard line, certainly not from the House. You're going to find a cluster around the goalpost, a whole lot behind the goalpost, and not a few floating in the Anacostia River.
And you talked about, alluded to it just a little bit, but the media does not go without blame in all of this, correct?
It's a real headache and a major problem. I mean, we've got two issues here. The first is, one of the major drivers of this is tribal media emerging. And, you know, let's face it, the business models for all media have changed dramatically. But if you're Rush Limbaugh, and you've got 23 million listeners every day, or whatever the number is, and let's say that tomorrow Rush started off his show saying, you know, I've been agonizing this and thinking about it. I got to tell you, can't we all just get along? I mean, this has been terrible and destructive, and I didn't vote for this guy, but he's a good, patriotic American. He wants to do the right thing. We can work with him. We can work it out. 20 million, well, 40 million ears would immediately gravitate over to Laura Ingraham or Mark Levin or somebody else, and his money dries up. If Roger Ailes did the same thing on Fox and sent the signal out to all the anchors, within a week or so, I don't know who it would be, maybe Al Jazeera America would do another flip, but somebody would create Wolf News that would have the same message as Fox News, and that demographic that makes them so much money, 2.5 million people at any given time, gravitates right over there. The same thing is true of MSNBC. If they change somebody, remember MSNBC was on the trash heap. It was an experiment gone wrong. What people don't remember, now they're beefing up their website, but remember this was a partnership between Microsoft and NBC. It was supposed to take advantage of the new technologies. And they had nothing going for them. They almost scrapped it. And then they developed this model, and they're a shadow of Fox. But the fact is they're more valuable to Comcast than NBC is right now. So those business models work. And what it means is these sources of information, which are critical ones for large groups of people, and then get amplified by social media, have every interest in tribalization and further polarization. So you start to work towards some kind of a deal. What kind of breaking news do you get out of that? How do you get people who are outraged, who just want to hear this stuff over and over again, interested? But then you've got the mainstream press, which is dying on the vine, first of all. They don't have business models that work. And that's true even of cable news like CNN. I thought there was a terrific joke in one of the late night shows the other night that one of the CNN anchors in Atlanta had been walking down the street and was mugged and had her purse taken. And he said, of course, it happened on CNN, so unfortunately there were no witnesses. There's no
Jay Leno.
Yeah, there's no business model that works there, but that's true of newspapers who are going on the web and don't know how to make money out of it. But what's also true is they hate to be viewed as biased. They're trying to distinguish themselves in that way. They know what they learned in journalism school. Your job is to report both sides of the story. We've got these organizations like FAIR and Accuracy in Media and a whole lot of others just ready to pounce, and they're afraid of losing advertisers because they're seen as biased. So you fall back on the refuge of false equivalence, and there's a whole lot of that. And there's also, I did my column today on something that's just been driving me crazy, which I think has really been, it was, if not started, at least dramatically advanced by Bob Woodward over the last year. Why can't...
If I may, that was my next question. Here's the column. I printed it out before I came over here because if we've talked about the House and the Senate, there's another player here who's the President of the United States, and a lot of people say things would be a lot better if only Barack Obama had shown more leadership and reached out more to members of Congress.
Yeah, and so...
Teed you up here for that.
Woodward's theme has been, why can't Obama be like Bill Clinton and build these relationships? And because he didn't build those relationships, Republicans wouldn't work with him. And then when we got to the negotiations and the grand bargain, he pulled back from it and undercut John Boehner. And why can't he be like Lyndon Johnson? And he said, I've seen presidents, when times get tough, they work their will. And now it's been picked up on by Maureen Dowd. I must tell you, my dear friend and colleague Michael Robinson is here in the room. Both of us taught at Catholic University for a dozen years or more. We had quite an interesting array of students, from Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, to Terry McAuliffe and Ed Gillespie, to Martin O'Malley and Mitch Landrieu and Ovid La Montagne and many others. Maureen Dowd was a student at Catholic U, but never took a politics course. And boy, does it show. Great writer, terrible analyst, but it's all the same theme. And as I point out, there is, first of all, I mentioned in the column, I yell at the television set, haven't any of you idiots read Richard Neustat's magisterial presidential power? Did you never take a course on the limits of presidential power in a separation of powers system? And then you simply look at history. Schmooze more and you'll get things done. Tell me who schmoozed more than Bill Clinton. In lots of different ways, it's true, but nobody had more members of Congress over, of his own party or the other party, called them at all hours of the night and day, and reached out. How many votes did it get him on his budget plan from the Republicans? A big fat 0 in both houses. Now, he had the same number of Democrats almost as Barack Obama had, so presumably, in theory, he could have gotten this done just like that if his Democrats held together. They didn't, and it took him 8 months of humiliation to limp over the finish line because he finally got Marjorie Mezvinsky, Marjorie Margolis at the time and now again, and Bob Kerrey to provide that one vote to put him over the top. Sure helped him with health care, didn't it? And then we had impeachment. And if you look at Lyndon Johnson, some of the elements of the column were cut, but Johnson had, nobody was better with Congress, there's no doubt about it. Johnson had this great success in the 89th Congress, and it was his great skill, but he also had Everett Dirksen and Bill McCulloch, who were courageous Republicans who said, we're not going to gain a damn thing with civil rights and a voting rights bill, but by God, it's the right thing to do. And I will tell you, one, Mitch McConnell is not Everett Dirksen. And, is not going to work in the same way. And Dirksen was a plenty tough partisan in a whole lot of areas. But what's also true is that after the Republicans had big gains in 1966 and the numbers shifted, all of those great skills at understanding Congress and knowing the individual members and knowing how to push the right buttons and sweet talk some and threaten others didn't get him anything. And the same if you look at Franklin Roosevelt. The great successes came with overwhelming majorities of his own party in Congress. So there's an awful lot of mythology here, but it becomes a meme that gets picked up on by reporters. And the problem I have with it is not just that it's false or vastly overstated, but if we're going to get through this, behavior has to be held accountable. And you're not going to be able to hold it accountable if there's a fuzziness in what happens and that the reaction of everybody is, they're all the same. Or whatever happens, it's the president's fault. Obama, I think, has misplayed his presidency in very serious ways. It is inexplicable to me why he abandoned the bully pulpit in his first 4 years. Not that it was going to sway members of Congress to change their positions. You can't go to the public and somehow alter people who have their own constituents and know them better than you do. But what you can do is frame the agenda. And you can provide your members with traction when they've got to go back and explain things that have been unpopular. And what Obama did was to let his adversaries frame the agenda. They framed it on the stimulus package, they framed it on the health care plan, and they framed it on a whole lot of other things. I talked to people in the White House early on, and I said, you guys have got to get Obama to do a Ross Perot. And the response was, well, we're not focused on deficits right now. We got a terrible economy. I said, I don't mean the substance. I mean the style. Go on national television with handmade charts and say, here's where the economy was when I got elected. Here's where the economy was when I got inaugurated. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we've done. Here's the challenge ahead. Here are the things that are going to be really tough and it'll take a long time to fix. But he didn't do any of that, and he let others define it for him. It is inexplicable to me how you could come into office having been a professor of constitutional law and been in the Senate long enough to see the dynamic of what happens with judicial nominations and the power of the judiciary now, and you're not ready to go when you've got the traction at the beginning of presidency to fill all those judicial vacancies. I can't understand it. They did nothing to alter in ways that they could have. And George Bush, by the way, was absolutely terrific in transition. There has been no better president willing to go the extra mile to aid the transition for an incoming president of the other party. Josh Bolten, as chief of staff, was instrumental in it, but Bush was there, and they took no advantage of it. So there are plenty of things that he's done wrong. But the idea that he could have sweet-talked people who had a strong desire and a strategy from the get-go, and we know from inaugural eve on, the approach was, we're going to vote in unison against him, whatever it is. If he's for it, we're against it. Or that he could somehow overcome that and work his will is just nonsense.
See what I mean? Nobody knows it better. Norm? This is great. Now, you've been looking at this crowd. You know, there are a lot of people here who have worked in the Congress and around the Congress. Are you ready to tackle this group?
I don't know. Only time will tell.
Let's go. We'll start here.
Tell me who you are, please.
Gilbert Adams. I'm retired and live here in the area. You mentioned something about the dynamics of getting senators to vote a certain way and getting House members to vote a certain way. What is the influence of the gerrymandering, districting that makes the primaries so much more crucial for the House members than the senators?
A good question, and I will say, where as I travel around the country, it's, if not the first question that comes up, one of the first two, almost always. So this has penetrated public consciousness, and it's a problem. It's a serious problem, and I've worked at changing it with many others, yet going state by state. I'd love it if every state adopted some version of the Iowa system, or the Arizona system, or even the California system.
The California system.
Yeah, any of those. But the problem is much bigger than that, and unfortunately, if we fixed it, it's no panacea. And I'll just mention a couple of things. The first is, Bob Bennett didn't lose the ability to even run for his own party's nomination because of redistricting. Arlen Specter didn't leave the Republican Party because he couldn't possibly win a primary because of redistricting. It's a bigger problem rooted in a lot of these cultural changes in our politics. The second problem here is there really has been, as Bill Bishop said, a big sort. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, people have increasingly moved into areas where they're surrounded by like-minded others. So if you did a redistricting, and that means we create a bunch of districts, some of it's through redistricting, some of it is a more natural phenomenon, that are homogeneous in nature, and now they become homogeneous echo chambers. But let's say you instead created a bunch of districts that were not drawn in bizarre ways, that were compact, that represented communities of interest. Now it wouldn't help very much. You're still going to end up with homogeneous districts. So we need to deal with it, but it is no panacea. And we've got bigger problems. And far more significant to me is enlarging the electorate in primaries and general election contests in ways that dilute the impact of the shrill ideological minorities who now dominate in those processes. So the California system of open primaries, well, look, if I had my druthers, if I could wave the magic wand, I would bring us the Australian system of mandatory attendance at the polls. In Australia, for 7 decades, they've had a system where you don't have to vote. You can go to the polls and cast a ballot for none of the above, about 3% do. Or you can write a note, a letter, explaining that you couldn't be there because you were sick or you were traveling or whatever. If you don't do those things, you're subject to a fine of between $15 and $20. And it's a little bit like the DC bag tax expanded. People change their behavior in the face of a tax. And they went from an average of a turnout roughly like ours, 50% or so. Every single election since has been over 90%. Now, I'm not going to tell you that 90% turnout is an indication of health in a political process in and of itself. The former Soviet Union had 98% regularly. Chicago gets to But what's striking about it is, I've been to Australia a number of times, and I know a lot of their political figures from across the spectrum. What they'll tell you is, if you know that your base is going to be there, and you know that their base is going to be there, first of all, you don't have the Karl Roves or James Carvilles who make lots of money by base-driven politics, by acting to scare the crap out of your own base and suppressing the other sides. But secondly, it changes the way you look at the election and the electorate. You're not aiming at your base or their base anymore. They're there. You're aiming at the persuadable voters in the middle. It changes the issues you focus on. It changes the rhetoric you use. It's not, there's nothing, this is a deeper cultural issue now, so nothing's going to be, decisive in altering things, but that would make a difference. But of course, we're not going to do that. We don't do mandates, generally speaking, especially with elections. So what do? I'd like to make voting easier in a whole host of ways. What Colorado is doing this week is wonderful, in my view. They are, although I'm not happy with vote by mail, because you lose the zone of privacy in an election booth, a polling booth, and I don't like the ability to vote many weeks before an election. It's like voting on the outcome of an NBA game at the end of the third quarter. But they're giving people all kinds of options. They're enabling people to vote at the polls, but they can go to any polling place within the area or the precinct. And they use vote centers so that you can go to your Walmart, park easily, go inside. They have ample poll workers and machines and technicians if something goes wrong, and same-day voter registration. I helped to create an organization called Why Tuesday, whytuesday.org, designed to move the election to the weekend, which I think would be if I had my druthers, we would have, election day would be a 24-hour period from noon Saturday to noon Sunday. No rush hour traffic first thing in the morning or late at night, no Sabbath problems, and the California system of open primaries combined with preference voting, so that you don't enable an extreme candidate to win with a plurality so easily. And I do think in California, it's not that, experience has not been that you're going to get necessarily all moderate candidates, and it's not that we should desire to have all moderate candidates. I mean, you want to have a representation of all different points of view. But what's happened now is the primary-driven process, the outside money and the groups, means that incumbents are intimidated away from voting for compromise because the primary challenge, well-financed, can knock them off, and it's the only thing that matters. That's where the districting comes into some considerable degree. In an open primary, especially if there's preference voting, you're not going to be as intimidated. It's not as easy to have somebody else prevail under those circumstances. Yep. Although I must tell you that until we alter the Citizens United driven money process now, which is careened out of control, all of these other changes are still going to have limits in what can be done with money being such a driver.
Can we get the microphone around? Yeah. Right here in the, okay. Right here in the second row, and then we'll go in the back there. Is there another microphone available? No, I don't. No. Okay, we'll move this one around. Thanks.
Okay, commendable, but what incentive is there for the state legislatures who seem now to be restricting the franchise to widen the franchise?
There isn't much. And
can everyone hear the question in the back? Yeah, okay, thank you.
There isn't much incentive, and parties filter this stuff through their own self-interest. It happens to be the case now that Democrats see it in their self-interest to enlarge the electorate. I wouldn't put it past them to decrease the electorate if they saw it in their own self-interest, but they're on the right side of history on this one now, and Republicans see it in their interest to suppress the electorate. I would love to get to a point where you'd have many more Republicans, and I do think the Jeb Bush, Mitch Daniels wing of the party views it this way, who would say, we've got to create a message that will appeal to a wider group of voters, rather than say, hey, let's not alter the message, instead let's keep that wider group of voters from voting. But it is the case that if you look at where they're using measures to restrict the electorate and suppress the vote, it's the Republican-dominated legislatures, and Colorado's doing this with all Democrats and Republicans opposed. So that's a challenge. Open primaries may not be quite as great a challenge if you have states that have not yet been taken over by a more extreme wing that understand, especially if you've got a highly competitive state. If you're in a place like Pennsylvania, say, where you would hope you'd have Republicans saying, you know, as the demographics shift, we're going to need to be able to provide some protection for more moderate candidates to be able to prevail in districts that are not skewed that much against them. So you might be able to see some movement there. And I don't see any inherent reason why moving elections to the weekend should be a partisan issue, although it's moving more in that direction because everything is becoming tribal.
And I know there's a hand in the back, please. Yes. And again, tell us who you are, if you can, please.
Hi, my name is Trey. I was wondering what you think about the prohibition of earmarks and what that's done to prevent leaders from being able to make compromise with their own members and members of the other party.
I'm torn on the earmark issue. I mean, first of all, you're going to have decisions made about how you allocate resources and where you put them. And having those decisions made by, to use a term unnecessarily pejorative, faceless bureaucrats or people who don't have a particular tie to an area or know what's going on is not necessarily better than having them made by elected officials. But the earmark process completely careened out of control and became a very corrupt one. And it wasn't just earmarks, though. It was a lot of other things. It was the letting of contracts. It was the Randy Duke Cunningham phenomenon. But also, you had a lot of earmarks done by people who had property and managed to get facilities or highway ramps put near their own property and benefited from it that way. This was a dirty process. It used to be controlled by leaders, including on the Appropriations Committee, which, contrary to the popular belief now, was not some group of people who were all, huge pigs waiting to feed at the trough. The Appropriations Committees were the guardians against that process, and then it began to careen out of control. Now, I think it's gone probably too far. And you hit on something that's important, which is if leaders are in a position where they think it's in their larger interest, maybe their party's larger long-term interest, maybe the country's interest, to find some compromise, and they've got to bring along recalcitrant members, they have fewer arrows in their quiver, fewer weapons at their disposal to be able to do it. Frankly, though, I think if you're going to say to somebody, I'll deny you a project or I won't give you something, and that's put up against the Club for Growth waving $3 million checks around to run against you, you're still not going to have a whole lot that will enable you to prevail.
Time for another question or so. If we can get the microphone up here, please. Hi.
Thank you. My name is Ann, and I have several questions. I don't know which one to give you. But I guess one of the ones I was thinking about, I read The Broken Branch. I haven't read the new book yet. But The Broken Branch did a really good job for me of explaining that it's not just partisanship, but it's process issues. Yeah. And to that end, there's a group called No Labels out there that has proposed, I think, 12 different procedural changes. And I'm wondering if you've looked at that at all and what impacts you think any of that might have.
Let me answer that in two ways. First, thank you for reading The Broken Branch. And you're right. And one of the dismaying things is we used to have a lot of institutionalists in Congress, and that was true in both parties. People who came and believed in protecting and preserving the institution over the longer run. One of my real objections to term limits, as we've seen it play out in California and other places, is that you lose that entirely what interest would you have in building an institution if you're only going to be there for a few years, and you're much better off doing something that has a big splash now and let the people who succeed you have to answer for it and downgrade things. But we just have fewer and fewer people who feel that way and make any kind of a commitment. But some changes are in order, and No Labels has a good general attitude. Some of those reforms actually came from me. I worked with them. I will tell you. No, that's okay. Including, you know, I for a long time have suggested that we change the schedule to 3 weeks on and 1 week off, that you need to have an incentive to have members move families to Washington and build relationships. You know, in the world that exists today, as we've described it, it's not enough. You're not going to alter some of this larger behavior, but it would still be good. And frankly, you're not going to have any kind of a deliberative process if you're here 2.5 days a week, and if you're spending every spare minute running off the Capitol campus to raise money, to do call time. So my proposal was you do 3 weeks on, Monday 9 a.m. to Friday 5 p.m., 1 week where you can go back to your district or do something else, but in the 15 days you're in Washington, no fundraising. Still got 15 days a month to do the fundraising. So they've got that. Where they lost me was in enthusiastically adopting an idea from Jim Cooper, whom I think the world of. I think is one of the best members of Congress that we have. But Jim has this cockamamie idea of no budget, no pay. And I strongly urge them not to do this. It's pandering of the worst sort. You know, this is in there because it gets the greatest response. It's poll tested, but it is one. And you know, the idea here is if Congress doesn't pass a budget resolution, the members don't get any pay. One, it's collective punishment. A lot of these members have no say in whether a budget comes up or doesn't come up. Two, it's saying the worst thing about them, and you know, it's playing to the worst instincts. And three, it gives enormous power to the richest members of Congress, who could care less if they get their pay or not. But they can now hold a budget hostage for those members who don't have the resources. So it's just a stupid thing to do. Not to mention the reality that a budget resolution is nowhere near what it has been portrayed as being. It's not, first of all, it's not a law. It is a resolution. Second, what we see now, and this is another interesting part of the dynamic, we had 4 years, and this was a powerful message. The Senate hasn't passed a budget. Why doesn't the Senate pass a budget? They can't even pass a budget. And from Republicans in both the House and Senate, it was, if they passed a budget, we could return to the regular order, and we could get to a conference, and we could work out our differences. So now the Senate passed a budget. It was because included in the fiscal cliff plan, at their insistence, was the no budget, no pay. But frankly, the reason it passed the Senate was they finally had what they believed was enough political traction that passing a budget that put more taxes on the rich and didn't cut some of the programs that are popular was perfectly okay. So they weren't going to have their members out on a long limb voting for something that could be used against them in the next election. So they passed the budget and then say, let's go to conference. And now all the people who said, well, now, you know, we need the regular order are saying, well, we don't want a conference. We don't need a conference. So this is all for show anyhow. And what rankled me was you could get an acknowledgement of the weakness of this idea, but they still jumped all over it because it gives No Labels a lot of traction and credibility, and now you get an email every other day saying, look what we've managed to do together. So I still like the people, and and there are a lot of very good people who are trying to find a middle ground and common ground in the process and move away from some of the worst rhetoric and attacks, but I'm not as enthusiastic.
So, Norm, the book again, his latest book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks. It is available. Norm has graciously agreed to hang around and sign copies for you.
Or your mother.
Right. When we break up. Let me ask you a final question. I'd like to maybe end on a note of hope. When I look at it, I see the Gang of Eight in the Senate. I see Joe Manchin and Pat Toomey. There is a sort of a quiet gang of 8 in the House that's working on immigration reform as well. President, for the first time, took 3 senators out to play a round of golf. He's had dinner with Republicans and now with the Democratic leadership. So are things maybe getting a little better?
Well, I hope so. And I think the only approach, given what we said about the House and the Senate, the only approach that's feasible now on most of these issues is you try and find 70 votes in the Senate and then frame it so that poor John Boehner, who has the worst job in America,
is doing the worst job or has the worst
has
job?
the worst job.
I just want...
But, the fact is anything that passes the Senate and would be supported by the President is only going to pass the House with far more Democrats than Republicans. You are the Speaker of the entire House, you're a constitutional officer, but you're the leader of your party. And you've got to figure how many, call them get-out-of-jail-free cards, does John Boehner have where he can bring up things that will be opposed by 2/3 of his own party. My off-the-cuff rough answer is 6, maybe. He's used 3. 1 on the fiscal cliff, 1 on Hurricane Sandy, 1 on the Violence Against Women's Act. So maybe you got 3 to go. Maybe sometime down the road you have to use 1 on guns. You're certainly going to have to use 1 on immigration. And if they manage to get a mini bargain with entitlements and revenues, there's your 6th one. And it's the only way you can go. I think what Obama is discovering on the guns issue, and maybe now on the grand or mini bargain, although we're not there yet, but after saying to him, look, you take the first step, but you got to be the leader, you got to get out there and not just endorse, but put in your budget some of these very difficult things that got the left going ballistic. Find me one who stepped up and said, okay, you did your part, now I'll tell you what, here's a plan that I can support to raise more revenues. They're letting them hang out there, so I worry about that. On immigration, let's face it, you've got, and you can see what's happened to a Republican Party. Remember when Ronald Reagan had that wonderful line about disorder in his White House? He said, well, sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the far right hand is doing. Well, now, the far right is sort of not even right anymore. It's all the way off. And you can see when you've got Marco Rubio attacked by Jim DeMint and others on this front, that this is tricky. But let's face it, the drive on immigration reform is not because people are saying, for the good of the country, we've got to do immigration reform. You wouldn't have the willingness to stand up to these people if it weren't for them seeing this as the only way to compete as a majority party. So it's a self-interest in this case that's different from a lot of these other issues. And whether you can make that play out in a broader sense remains to be seen. And I think you can see in some of the comments that Obama's made in the last few weeks, even though he's still going to play this out because it's the only set of cards he has to play, a frustration and an unease, and now we see it on the nomination side, that we're back to the same old. And of course, the other challenge he's got is Mitch McConnell is up, and John Cornyn, the number 2 leader, is up. It's not only that McConnell and Cornyn have to worry about a primary challenge. McConnell's probably almost past that point. But if you look at the overall polls numbers in Kentucky, he's weak. And he cannot afford to have the right wing sit on its hands. John Cornyn saw what happened to David Dewhurst. Mm-hmm. And so now you look at these guys, and instead of saying to Ted Cruz, sit down or we will crush you like a bug, which admittedly you can't do in the way that might have been doable in previous decades, it's if he says jump, they say how high, because the most radical forces now have a sway over the leadership. So the best you can hope for is that Mitch McConnell plays a passive-aggressive role. He sits and lets the gangs of 6 and 8 and 10 and whatever they may be do their work, He can vote against it in the end, but he'll let it come up and he'll let those things pass. But that's, you know, you put all of that stuff together and you can try to be more hopeful, but it's getting harder.
Well, I base my hope on the fact that your voice is out there, Norman Ornstein. Thank you, sister. Thank you again.